And good afternoon, Chuck Morse, Left Right Radio with Chuck, yours truly, Chuck Morse. Welcome to the program. My guest is Larry Stone. He's the author of several books, including The Story of the Bible, most recently, named one of the 10 best Christian books of the year, 2010. Women of the Bible, a graduate of Moody Bible Institute and the University of Iowa School of Journalism. Larry has studied in the New York University Graduate School of Business Administration. He taught writing seminars in Africa, America, and the Caribbean. Larry has appeared in many major programs, including Janet Marshall, Janet Mefford, and Bob Dufko. Larry, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
I enjoy it. Looking forward to it.
Larry, first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about your view and your approach to biblical studies. Are you looking at them in the context of scientifically proving that these events happened, or is it a spiritual thing, or is it both?
In a sense, it's both. I mean, I try to approach biblical studies. It's impossible for anybody to do so, but with as few preconceptions as I can, trying to let what the Bible says speak to me rather than me read my own ideas into the Bible, if that makes sense.
No, I think it's very relevant, and I would think that there's been a major effort by the left in general to try to disprove the Bible, while the fact of the matter is that the Bible as a historical document is at least as legitimate and as valued as the Greek philosophers, or like Socrates, or ancient Chinese texts, or ancient texts from any peoples. They are texts that at some point were written down. They had been oral law as well. In the case of the Judeo-Christian Bible, we believe that it was handed by God at Sinai. But putting aside the spiritual questions, as a question of history, the history is as legitimate as any ancient history. And I think that it's often singled out by enemies of Christianity and Judaism to try to claim that these things didn't happen, when in fact they would recognize the history of all other ancient societies.
Well, there's actually two things I can say. In terms of the text of the Bible, we have a much more evidence for the reality and the accuracy of it than we have for almost any other ancient document. For instance, you take some of the writings like Homer or other Greek people, the manuscripts we have for their writings are hundreds or sometimes 1,000 years later than when they actually wrote it. In terms of the Bible, we have manuscripts that go back to within 100, not entire manuscripts, but partial manuscripts that go back within 100 or 150 years of when the authors wrote it. In terms of quantity, some of these writings will have a dozen, maybe 20 manuscripts. In terms of the New Testament and the Old Testament, we have not hundreds, we have thousands of manuscripts. The other interesting thing is when it comes to people saying, yes, I believe what the Bible says, or yes, I take the accuracy of the Bible or believe it's legitimate history, when you go back into history, you find that most people for hundreds and hundreds of years accepted the Bible for what it said. Until we get into about the 1700s, when the times of enlightenment started in France and came over to the United States, that's when 1700s and 1800s, people said, I don't think that really happened, and began to question it. And whether you approach it as people looking at the accuracy of the history of the Bible, whether you approach it in terms of people saying, yes, I agree that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, that's when things started to change.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was an agenda that started in the Enlightenment right around the time of maybe the French Revolution. But the fact is that from a scientific standpoint, there is increasing evidence that the Bible stories are true. Now, we can debate whether or not some of the nuances of them are true and whether or not some of the spiritual aspects are true. That's a matter of faith and belief. But the actual events as described, there's increasing archaeological evidence and other evidence to indicate that they are true, even to the point where I read recently that the scientific community is now talking about the the mitochondrial Eve, the mother of the human race, and the Y chromosome Adam, the father of the human race. And many scientists are now looking at the likelihood that all of mankind indeed did descend from one man and one woman. Mm-hmm. So, this is, it isn't just a matter of, folklore or faith. There are scientific evidences or scientific theories that are based on some consensus and some evidence that these things did in fact happen. Now, one of your books, Larry, specifically deals with the Great Flood,
right?
The story of Noah. Now, this is something that is recorded by ancient cultures all over the world. That's that right. there was some kind of an event. I mean, there are caves that were discovered in China where they show a flood and they show a series of events that are very similar, quite strikingly similar to the events described in the book of Genesis. The Hopi Indians in America have a similar story in terms of a great flood that overtook them and that events that occurred. I mean, obviously, each of these cultures have their own kind of local nuances on the story, but nevertheless, it is a piece of oral law that has gone way back in many, many cultures. So that does indicate that there was indeed a great flood and that Noah and his family were able to survive the great flood. So talk a little bit about your research in that regard.
Well, there are over 300 what we call flood stories from all around the world, just as you said. And in the book, Noah, the Real Story, we tell, I think it's 3 of those in more detail. But in fact, you mentioned the Chinese. One of the more interesting things is, of course, Chinese don't use letters in writing the way we do. It started out as pictograms and then evolved from there. The pictogram, or the word for in Chinese, the character in Chinese for big boat or large ship consists of 3 characters: the 8, person, and boat. A big boat, 8 people in one boat, sounds like Noah.
Incredible, yes, and the 3 sons and their wives.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Yeah, and it's easy to look at all these stories. So, for instance, the Gilgamesh epic, which comes out of Middle East, predates what Moses wrote down in Genesis. And so people will say, well, Moses got his ideas from the Gilgamesh epic. Well, the fact of the matter is, just as you said, if 300 cultures across the world have stories of flood, it may be, and I believe it is, a cultural history of a great flood.
Right. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And I would even go one step further and add that there's scientific evidence of it as well. Like there's been discoveries on the tops of mountains, I think in the United States, the Rockies, where they find, sea mammals and they find fossils which indicate ocean, fish. Mm-hmm. How did they get to the top of the Rocky Mountains? I mean, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, growing bodies of scientific evidence to indicate that there had been a great flood. Now, did the flood cover the entire earth? That's debatable. I mean, Noah would have had no way of absolutely knowing that. Mm-hmm. But we do know that there was, based upon the oral law and even upon growing scientific evidence, that there was a great flood. And that the events as described in the book of Genesis are true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that we do in the book is we look at 2 of these local flood theories, one of which involves the Black Sea and one which involves the Euphrates. Another interesting thing is there was a great flood in the western United States. There was a huge lake in the western United States that many scientists didn't think it existed until somebody found in the early 1900s evidence for it. Mm-hmm. And if those who agree with the idea of the worldwide flood generally will say that at that time before the flood, the world was not configured the way it is. And they hypothesize a Pangea, or that all of the existing continents were together. and that part of the Great Flood wasn't just a lot of water, it was a cataclysmic upheaval of the whole earth. And at that point, the Pangea, or this one great big continent, if you will, broke apart: Africa, Asia, America. And that's when, for instance, was the Indian subcontinent crashed into Asia to create the Mount Everest and other mountains along there.
Right, the tectonic plates. I mean, there's a good deal of scientific evidence to show that there was a separation, and you can see how Africa might have fit into the central part between North and South America. I've heard, for example, that even Florida was a piece of Africa that stayed attached to the Americas. I mean, there's some amazing research being done in that area, and how it affected, you know, as you say, mountain ranges and the development of rivers and whatnot. Very much the kind of stuff that's that's consistent with biblical teaching. In fact, I don't think that there's anything in the scientific understanding of things, which is a study of God's creation, that would contradict anything in the Bible, other than obviously supernatural events which can't be explained. It's a mystery how they happen, whether you believe in a creator of the universe or not. That's something that I think is self-evident, because there's obviously a mystery to being alive. I mean, we're not just a bag of bones that move around. I mean, there's something bigger going on. I mean, it's just, it's self-evident that there's a greater mystery to existence than simply the materialist explanation. So, I don't think that it's unreasonable at all to assume that there were incredible events that involved the creator at that time.
Well, God has told us an awful lot in the Bible, but he's not told us all of the details. And sometimes I think we get ourselves in trouble when we try to, you can say, for instance, that the rocks, what we find in geology, doesn't lie. There is evidence there for us. You can also say that what's in the Bible doesn't lie, and that there's evidence there of how God created the heavens and the earth and the flood and that sort of thing. Where we get ourselves in trouble on both sides is where we say, I'm going to deny the evidence that I find in geology, or on the other side, I'm going to deny what the Bible says. And what we need to do is to take the evidence of geology and the Word of God and find out what happened by looking at both of them.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, this whole idea of a separation of science and faith is an artificial construct anyways, that was developed as part of the Enlightenment, that in fact, up until that time, the greatest of scientists were people of faith.
Yes.
I mean, the Talmud was made up of scientists who were taking a look at how the earth worked and applying moral and ethical principles which derive from a study of life and a study of existence and reality. So they were not separate disciplines. I mean, they were complementary. They might have studied different aspects of nature, but one thing did not necessarily have to be viewed as in an entirely separate entity.
Right.
Now you've written also a book, The Story of the Bible, which is as you describe it, a fascinating history of its writing, translation, and effect on civilization.
Yes.
Now, is this a look at, I want to talk a little bit about that. Is this an examination of the ideas that emanate from the Bible and how they affect our societies?
Well, it's really the story of how we got the Bible, how it was translated, how it was written. I had a little bit of a chapter on what's actually in the Bible, then how it was translated. And so when I talked about the evidence of, not the evidence, but the transmission of it, how we have so many manuscripts, how we have manuscripts all the way back to within a couple hundred years of when John wrote them, for instance, that's the kind of thing we talk about there. The book itself, The Story of the Bible, one of the fascinating things is it has 10 envelopes in it and 23 pull-out pages of life-size pages from the world's most important Bible. So it has a life-size page, for instance, of the Great Isaiah Scroll, part of the Great Isaiah Scroll, a life-size page from the First King James Bible, and some of the medieval Bibles that have illuminated Bibles, and then its effect on civilization. So, for instance, I talk about in there how America was founded on the Bible. And a good example of what I mean by that is in the Capitol building of the United States, there's all these paintings of American history. And one of them was the Pilgrims as they were getting ready to leave Holland. Actually, they went from England to Holland to America. They're on the boat getting ready to go to America. And the main character right in the middle is holding a Bible. And the focus of the light of the way the art is done is on the Bible. Now, our world today, our culture today in the United States may not be focused on the Bible, but 100 years ago when this painting was done, everybody recognized that the Bible was the center of the founding of the United States. So that's the kind of thing I talk about.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, certainly the Bible was the main animating instrument of all of the founding fathers, regardless of their particular denomination or lack of denomination. And that's quite clear from their quotes, and that they derived much of the founding principles from the Bible. The most fundamental of all is discovered in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, where he talks about that we're endowed by the Creator and not by the state, the Creator being God, with rights.
Yeah.
In other words, that this is what made this country unique. The fact is that we were actually closer to the biblical ideal than any society at that point in history, that we didn't view rights as coming from a king or rights as coming from, frankly, a pope or from any secular human being, but that rights came from God. And that's directly out of the book of Genesis, when God basically says that he created man and women, and he does say women also, in his image. We are all created as images of the divine. That's therefore where we derive our rights, and that's where we derive our understanding of restraint and morality and all of those things, because we're images of God. And I think that's what Jefferson was taking when he talked about that we're endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights.
And another interesting thing I talk about in there, and this happened in both German and in English, it was the Bible that helped create or bring together those languages and cultures. Martin Luther translated the Bible into German. Before that, there was many dialects, and it was because of his Bible that the Germans had a unified language, and in many respects, it was instrumental in bringing together the small parts of Germany together. In English, Tyndale translated the Bible, but then it was the King James Bible that was done in 1611 that became the Bible that every family would have. If they didn't have any other books, they'd have a Bible. And everywhere the English went, they took the King James Version with them. So whether you're reading the Bible in Australia or memorizing a verse out of the Bible in India, or whether you're preaching about it in America, you all use the same words. And so the language and the culture transmitted through the King James Bible affected English throughout the world.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Luther really did bring the Bible out of the church, and he made it available to families and to individuals by translating it into a vernacular language and publishing it. Of course, the Gutenberg Press helped as well.
Yes.
And that, the word of the Bible spread across the planet that way. I suppose it's a criticism, but I think that in the translation of the Bible, there has been things that have been lost every time it's translated. The original language of the Bible was Hebrew.
Yes.
And then when it was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, it was translated by rabbis, and it was legitimate people who had some credentials in terms of translating it. But nevertheless, the day that was published, and I think it was before the Romans, it was in Greek. What year? The Septuagint.
Yeah, that was about 300, well before the time of Christ.
Right. It was in the Ptolemaic Egypt, and it was a day of mourning for the rabbis, that because they felt like, oh, this is now, we've lost a generation of meaning because it's impossible to translate something exactly from the Hebrew to the Greek. And thus, while it's a celebrated Bible in Jewish tradition still, nevertheless, it was not the same. And then, of course, the Romans then it got translated from the Greek to the Latin, which is the Vulgate, and then from the Latin to the English, which is the King James. Now, these are...
Actually, the King James was translated from the Greek and Hebrew into English.
Oh, was? Okay. Well, then it's a generation ahead of the Vulgate. But the thing is that there are mistakes in each translation because sometimes it's impossible to translate a particular word in its true meaning and its true essence.
Well, I'll give you an interesting story about that. When there was a guy named Erasmus that did a definitive Greek New Testament, and he looked at all the older manuscripts and put together this New Testament. This was about in the 1600s, I think it was. And there's a passage, just a few words in 1 John that is in the Vulgate, in the Latin Vulgate, that is not found in any Greek manuscript. I'm not sure where it came from. I don't know if Jerome put it in or not. Mm-hmm. But Erasmus did not have this in his first edition of his Greek New Testament, these words, this half a sentence. He was talking to a guy in Spain who had just published a Greek New Testament. And this guy said, these words need to be in there. To which Erasmus said, well, if you can find a manuscript that has them in Greek, I'll put them in. A little while later, a manuscript shows up on Erasmus's desk with those words in. Very clearly, what this man in Spain had done was taken the Latin, translated it into Greek, and sent it off to Erasmus. Mm-hmm. Erasmus knew it wasn't in the originals, but because he had given his word, he put it in his third edition. That's the edition that Tyndale used when he had made his translation into English. That's what was picked up in the King James. And there's a half a verse in 1 John that everybody agrees isn't in any of the original manuscripts, but it's in the King James.
Amazing. So there are, what I would say in the overall is that the Bible has it right. I mean, there are mistakes. There are some mistranslations. I mean, I'm going to give you one example of something that was mistranslated in the English King James, and that is to deal with homosexuality as an abomination. Mm-hmm. The original Hebrew Bible does not use the word abomination. It uses the word less holy or to'ava. In other words, it's not, the kind of behavior that gets the good housekeeping seal of approval. It's not like condoned, and it's a step away from holiness, but it's not an abomination. That takes on a different tone. And that worked its way into the English Bible, and that's actually not accurate because, it's not referred to that in the Hebrew text. It's a mistranslation of the word to'ava.
But the important thing is that for all of the, not errors, but all of the differences in various manuscripts of the Bible, the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts, there is no difference that makes any difference in what God is saying to us about himself. And there's no doctrine of the Christian faith that is in danger because of differences in translation. They tend to be little differences, almost all of them.
That's right. And I would say the New Testament is probably in many ways more accurate in the English because it had less generations of translation, in that it was probably originally written in Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of Judea at the time of Jesus, and in the generation probably after Jesus. So, it's less of a hurdle in terms of translation.
Well, one of the things that I've been involved in the last couple of years that's very, very interesting is I've been editing an Africa study Bible. Now, in some senses, I could do that. I'm not African, but I've lived in Africa and I've been part of the African culture. And so much of what the Christians in Africa have is stuff that's written by Americans or British. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, there's a story a friend of mine was in a church in Sierra Leone, and the pastor was preaching about prayer. And he says, prayer is not like a vending machine where you can just ask God for anything you want, and because you put in your quarter, you get out the Mars bar. And so after the service, my friend walked up to the pastor and said, have you ever seen a vending machine? He said, no, I have no idea what it's like, what one is. It's an illustration of what prayer is like that this pastor got from an American book. And there is an American book, Prayer is Not Like a Vending Machine. Great illustration, but not if you don't know what a vending machine is.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's experiences in Africa where they have insights that we might not have. And I can give you an example of that that's, I think, is very good. In some parts of Africa, if you have drought, monkeys will know how to find water when humans don't. But the monkeys don't want you to know. So what you do is you capture a monkey and you tie him up and you feed him salt until he becomes so thirsty that you let him go, and he's going to run for that water even if you're following him. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. And if our job, if you want to call it that, is to make people so thirsty for the water of life, Jesus Christ, that we'll want to follow him. Great illustration, but it comes from an African context.
Right. I mean, that's fantastic. And that probably goes to why Christianity, both Catholicism and Protestantism, is fast growing in Africa.
Absolutely.
And that many of the African countries are Christian majority at this point. And that, and I think it's also true in China.
Yes.
Which it's interesting. I had an interview with a man who is a Chinese dissident who actually helped that blind Chinese dissident escape from China with the help of former President Clinton.
Yes.
This was a while back. And he came on my show and he said to me, he's a devout Christian. And he said that China today is a lot like Rome, in that Christianity is spreading rapidly, mostly through women, which was also true in Rome, by the way. And that eventually what's going to happen is that the Chinese communist dictator is going to be like Constantine. One day he's going to wake up and realize that he lost, that the entire empire was Christian. And so he threw in the towel and he was baptized because it was just, there was nothing he could do at that point. The persecution, it just made no more sense. It had to stop. And he said that he thinks that's going to happen in China within the next generation, maybe the next 40 to 50 years. And it's a very positive development.
Oh, yeah. I mean, China and Africa are going to be the centers, or are the centers of Christianity, not Britain and the United States.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that they say that from a Catholic standpoint, probably the next pope is going to be a Black African, and that Africa really has become the locus of growth in the Catholic Church, and probably as well in Protestant churches.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we don't realize is how important Africa has been in the history of Christianity. The man that carried Christ's cross for him was African. One of the early writers of the four Gospels, Mark, he was African. St.
Augustine was African.
Pardon?
St. Augustine.
Yes, St. Augustine was African.
Yep.
And one of the earliest councils of the church, the Council of Nicaea, there was two sides arguing. The leaders of both sides, Arius and Athanasius, were African. So Africa has played a huge role in the history of the church.
And it's becoming resurgent again. I mean, while Rome itself and while Europe is regressing into kind of a secular position in the world.
Yeah, very much so.
So, Larry, I want to bring things up to the present in terms of your work. You mentioned to me that you're working on some interesting things right now. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, there's several things I'm doing, one of which is a friend of mine and I have acquired the rights to many of the works of a gentleman named F.F. Bruce, who was called the Dean of Evangelical Scholarship. 100 years ago, most evangelicals rejected the idea of being scholars. They saw that as not being very spiritual. And most scholars rejected the idea of listening to evangelicals. And more than anyone, I won't say he did it all by himself, but more than anyone, this British scholar, F.F. Bruce, demonstrated that you can be an evangelical, believe in what the Bible says, and still be a respected scholar. And many of the leaders in church, schools and seminaries today will look back to his example and say, he gave me permission as a Christian to be a strong academic as well. And so we're republishing many of his works that have been out of print as ebooks, and we'll eventually publish them as print books. But there's interest in him all over the world. So the value of the ebook is it's easy to get them to Australia, to India, to South America. And so we did 11 of them last fall. We have 13 as ebooks now, and we're going to do about another 4 or 5 this spring. So that's one.
Fantastic. No, please keep me up to date on that, because I'd like to do some programming on that. It's a very important subject, especially for American academia, where religion is often shunned, and seen as like a separate discipline. And even some of the religious educators shun religion, as you know. Like we could talk about Harvard Divinity School, but that's another subject. Mm-hmm. But there's like a kind of a disdain for faith that pervades and that is a given, as I guess you might say, an article of faith for the academic establishment. So it's very important what you're doing, and it sounds a little bit like C.S. Lewis also, and G.K. Chesterton, both great British thinkers who are also very religious and devout Christians.
Yes.
So that's very, very important work, Larry, and I appreciate you doing it.
Well, thank you. One of the things that's really important to know or to remember is that when we approach the Bible, when we approach science, when we approach academia, when we approach anything, we need to let it speak to us rather than us try to put our preconceptions into it. And there's too much letting preconceptions rule, I believe, today. Just this morning, I get a marketing, of all things, a marketing blog every morning. And Seth Godin, this is what he said. He said, we make our own taste and call it reality. Most of us say, he said, this is better, therefore I like it. In fact, he said, the converse is what actually happens. I like it, therefore I'm assuring you and me that this is better. And I found that profound for the simple reason that that's how many of us approach a lot of things in life. We don't approach it looking for what reality is. We look at approaching it saying, how can I justify my own presuppositions?
Or if it's good, if it feels good, it's good.
Yeah.
It's kind of the Epicurean principle from the ancient Greeks. Yeah. And the rabbis of the Talmud saw that as the biggest enemies of faith and progress. They called them the Epicurists, the people who believe that whatever feels good is good.
Yeah.
If it doesn't feel good, it's not good. It's all that existence and the ultimate virtue is all based upon what the senses create, as opposed to a stepping away from that and looking at what is real, what actually is good and evil, and then integrating one's personal interests and desires into a bigger question of where it fits in terms of what's right or wrong and what's in existence. So in a way, that's what you're seeing in this advertising is part of the eternal struggle between our spiritual and our corporal sides, in a way. Yeah. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. So this thing with F.F. Bruce is something I'm really interested in. There's several other projects I'm still promoting and helping with the Africa Study Bible. I think that's still, I think that in many respects, because of the large number of people in Africa that are Christians, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, that have had very little resources that speak out of their own experience, I think this has potential for being one of the most important things I've ever done.
Oh, absolutely.
And I would like, my dream is ultimately that even us in the West will look to the Africans to see what they have to say to us, because they do. But we tend to, believe it or not, we tend to be too parochial usually. Think that the whole world is only between the Atlantic and the Pacific, when there's the rest of the world out there with insights that can help us.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, even from a secular standpoint, Africa holds a lot of the future, because it's a continent that has not been overly developed over the past several centuries. So everything is new there. Mm-hmm. And they're jumping into the latest in technology, in democracy, and all these disciplines that they're bringing in without some of the baggage and the old style of the past. So it's actually a fairly exciting time there. Of course, some of the governments are horrible and very corrupt, and that's another problem. But it's an emerging place. So I think that you're absolutely on the right track in terms of getting onto that trajectory and having an influence there. Now, Larry, we're reaching toward the end of the broadcast, so I'd like you to let my listeners know where they can get more information about you and your books and your work.
Yeah, I have a website for the two books you mentioned, The Story of the Bible. That is www.storyofbible.com. No, just storyofbible.com. And on there, if you want to know more information about myself or get to me, there's my whole resume is on there about the author. Also, then www.noahtherealstory.com has a lot of fascinating information about Noah, about the ark, about the animals. One of the things we never even talked about is the search for the ark. There's no biblical story that has as many tangents as the story of Noah, and each one is absolutely fascinating. And by way of a plug for the book, you can get books, many, many books on the search for the ark. You can get books about the animals. You can get a lot of books on the flood. But I don't know of any other book that brings it all together and puts it all together in one place. Not as in much detail, but it gives you a great overview of all the different stories.
Oh, you definitely get into the whole story of the flood and the animals and all of the events, both preceding, during, and immediately after this cataclysmic worldwide event.
Right.
Anyways, Larry, again, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Great talking with you.
It's been a lot of fun.
All right, Larry, take care.